Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for attending Underage Drinking in Texas, Your Brain, the Law, and Effective Prevention Strategies. Gabby Sewing is our strategy specialist.
Did we lose Ryan?
No, I think he keeps logging out and coming back in, but we'll figure out. He may be having some connection problems.
Off of it.
Oh,
Okay, I'm back.
sorry. Gabby, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, everyone can hear me. Hey, sorry, can everybody hear me all right? I see people typing, so that's a good sign. Sounds a little weird. How about now? Do we want to switch to conference call audio?
Just go. She said
that's that's better. All right.
You didn't have your microphone on.
I did. But, all right. I'm hoping this will work out a little bit better. Like Lindsay said, my name is Gabby. I guess talked to some of you at the last webinar. I talked a little bit about media, so I'm glad to be back. And as Lindsay said again, I'm the program coordinator, strategy specialist here. I've been at TSC for about 6 months now. So back to Lindsay, or no, just kidding, back to me. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about brain development, specifically about adolescent brain development and how alcohol affects that process. And so there's three major things kind of to know about the adolescent brain. The first is that it's really designed to change, and it does so during the teenage years by strengthening the neural connections that we use, and then also eliminating neural connections that we don't use as much, and that's called synaptic pruning. And that's important because during these changes, the brain is starting to learn really quickly what behaviors are triggering that reward system. And so when you consume something like alcohol that triggers the reward system, the brain basically starts to tell the body that this is a good activity, that you are enjoying this, and to keep on doing that activity. And third is that because the adolescent brain is undergoing these massive changes and reorganization, alcohol actually impacts the adolescent brain very differently than adults and can actually cause more harm. So I've got a little quiz for you guys, and if you could just respond in the chat box. I'm wondering what you think that, what the age range is that the brain has become fully developed. Got some B, got a C there. Is that everybody? I can't really. Well, you're in the right range. The answer to that is actually, it's B, between 20 and 25. And the graphic works. Great. And so you can see here that the brain is actually not fully developed until the mid-20s. The brain is still developing all through the teenage years. And so that is, partially why it is really important to kind of look at brain development, especially in terms of alcohol use, because the brain is still developing until, about 25 years old. Might be a little earlier for some, might be a little later for others. It's also really important to know that development is occurring in the brain from back to front. And so there's a greater likelihood of attempting, risky behaviors during adolescence and young adulthood, because the front of the brain, the cerebral cortex, and I'm going to talk about these areas in a little bit, that area of the brain is not actually fully developed. And so we also know that as your blood alcohol content, or BAC, is increasing, so does your impairment. So does anyone have any guesses about maybe what areas of the brain are affected by heavy alcohol consumption? And if you don't know, specific areas, maybe just functions even that you could guess. Frontal cortex. Yeah, absolutely. Any other ideas? Nobody is typing. Lindsay Tubbs is typing. Amygdala. You are both right. And I'm actually going to start. And now this graphic here, as I'm sure you are aware, is not an actual image of a brain, but this is just kind of an easier way to understand this information because there's a lot of sections of the brain. It can be really complicated, but for our purposes, we're just going to talk about 5 sections. And we're going to start from front to back because while the brain develops from back to front, alcohol is actually going to affect your brain in the opposite way, from front to back. So we're going to start at the frontal lobes, or the frontal cortex, as Sylvia pointed out. The frontal lobes are the decision-making center. So this is a part of the brain we were actually just talking about. It's responsible for your decision-making, for judgment, planning, and also impulse control. And so alcohol use can make a person willing to do something that they might not otherwise do, or they might have reservations about, maybe say something that they shouldn't. They're generally less fearful of consequences. And so that's the area of the brain that's going to first start to be affected by alcohol. And then kind of moving back, because again, alcohol is going to affect from front to back. So we're hitting into the amygdala now, which is kind of hard to say. And the function of the amygdala is it's responsible for producing fear and anxiety, especially during dangerous situations. So this is kind of referred to as fight or flight. You might have heard the terminology before. So when you start to consume alcohol, it's going to start to suppress the amygdala, and it's causing basically that voice in your head warning you that this situation might not be the best situation to be in. That voice is starting to stay quiet. And as we kind of move further back, and this is more into the midbrain, we're going to hit what's called the hippocampus, which is an awesome word because it sounds like hippopotamus. Okay. The hippocampus is responsible mostly for, in why it's important here is that it's responsible for making memories. So drinking enough to where you're starting to suppress the hippocampus is actually what can cause blackouts. So simply put, the process of turning short-term memory into long-term memory is being disrupted. So the memories you're making are not being encoded into the brain. And so the drinker maybe the next morning will wake up and won't remember anything that happened the night before. And that's because those memories were never actually translated into that long-term memory, which is really interesting. And so kind of moving to the back. So, and I know I've said this, already, but, our brains are developing from back to front. Alcohol is affecting from front to back. And so it makes sense that alcohol is going to start to affect us this way because the back of the brain, you're going to get into the areas where they're very vital to maintaining life. And so they're very important to your well-being, and it makes sense that they're kind of going to be the last parts affected due to their importance in that sort of the core functions of the human body. And so looking at the cerebellum, and that's that kind of black and white, I'm sorry it's not as well labeled on here. It's that black and white part of the diagram close to the bottom, as Lindsay's pointing to. And that's right above the brainstem. It's responsible for your coordination, for your movement, and also your balance. So as you can imagine, people who are consuming alcohol to the point where the cerebellum is being disrupted, they will be seen, falling down, stumbling, generally having very, very poor coordination. We're certainly past that, legal limit of 0.08 here. And finally, we are at the medulla oblongata, also a very fun thing to say. This is way at the bottom near the brainstem, which is basically right where between your head is connecting to your neck, right above the spinal cord. And so the medulla oblongata is going to handle your involuntary functions. And these are really, really critical to survival. So this includes breathing, this is monitoring your heart rate, maintaining homeostasis, which regulates your body temperature, and other reflexes such as vomiting. So that's why it's important, to place someone who is passed out kind of on their side. So if they do vomit, they do not choke and pass away. So you can see here why the disruption of this area of the brain is actually can be really life-threatening. And we're starting to get to that area where alcohol poisoning can occur, and death as well. I found an interesting study, and this is done out of University of California, San Diego, and reported on by NPR. And it basically looked at the brains of teens who drank very heavily, and then the brains of teens who did not drink heavily. And what they found was really interesting, I thought. They saw that there was damage to nerve tissue in the brain in teens that were drinking heavily, and it was resulting in poorer attention span, and also like lowered ability to comprehend and interpret visual information. And neuroscientists in the study, they found a 10% difference in short-term memory tests, described as the difference between an A and a B, between those who are drinking heavily and those who are not drinking. And really, basically, the review of a lot of neuroscience, the kind of latest journals of psychology, marketing literature, they are all coming to the conclusion that adolescents, because of how the brain develops, may be particularly attracted to branded products like alcohol that are associated with the more risky behaviors, and they provide some sort of immediate gratification, thrills, or some sort of perceived social status. And of course, like we know, alcohol triggers reward. So this is, like I mentioned before, your brain is starting to recognize when you're drinking alcohol and this feels good, and let's keep doing this activity because of those sort of positive effects. And the brain learns to associate alcohol and pleasure, and those connections are strengthened, and it can motivate continued and further use. Going on. And this is an interesting chart here. This is about the risk of alcohol dependence based on when an individual has started to drink alcohol. And they found that drinking at a younger age increases risk of alcohol dependence later in life. So the risk decreases as age increases. So if you start drinking at 17, the risk of being dependent on alcohol is about 28%. But if you wait to start drinking till about 21, the risk is only 9%. And I'm going to kind of switch gears here and talk just briefly. I know that you guys have heard a lot of this before, but I just want to touch upon just the general laws in Texas. And as you can see here, zero tolerance is really easy to understand. For minors, it is illegal to purchase or attempt to purchase alcohol, of course, to consume or possess, to lie about your age in order to get alcohol, also illegal. And of course, operating a vehicle with any alcohol in your system as well, and providing alcohol to anyone not 21, also against the law in Texas. For adults, there's some interesting points here. Of course, it's illegal to provide alcohol to anyone who's 21 or younger, except for your own child, and they have to be visually, within visual, I don't know how to say that, presence, I suppose. And yes, Lindsay. So that's a good point. Anyone recognize the woman in the PSA on the right of the screen? Okay, it's Nicole Holt. She's our executive director, and she is the lovely star of this PSA. And we have a few of these. This is part of our Don't Give to Minors campaign. Interesting. But some, I know, Nicole, we all expected better. So just to continue about kind of the adult version of alcohol and the law, is social hosting. Does anybody know what social hosting means, or what a social host is? Yeah, absolutely. That is correct. So, sorry, Lindsay was distracting me. So it's hard to prove possession to minors. So it's again, it's difficult to show that that an adult, somebody 21 years or older, is providing alcohol to somebody who's not their child, but is a minor. And so social hosting is an initiative that Texans Standing Tall is working on. It's something that's part of my grant, and I've been working on a little bit here as well. And that is how to enforce adults providing alcohol, maybe in their own homes, to others. And this isn't just, parents. This could also be older siblings or college students. So as you can imagine, this is a very big issue at universities as well. It's hard to enforce, of course, the penalty of providing the minors, because often the law enforcement officer has to be visually, seeing that this is occurring, and can then charge the adult with a Class A misdemeanor. And this is 1 degree below a felony. And so sometimes you find officers, they don't want to impose this penalty because they see it as too severe, and sometimes might let the adult off with a warning. And so we also see this a lot in rural areas, but it's not only occurring there. But in rural areas, it seems to be more common, just because I'd assume because of the fact that people there know each other, and the norms surrounding underage drinking are a little bit more relaxed, and officers are maybe not quite so willing to enforce the law on their neighbors. So I guess my last question to you before we go on is if you've noticed maybe in your communities about enforcing these types of issues where maybe adults are providing at all, or if anybody had any comments kind of about what they notice. I'm sorry. I'll just clarify. What I was just asking is maybe like home conditions in your area. So if you've noticed that while maybe you live in a college town and there seems to be a lot of older students supplying alcohol to younger, freshmen. Great, Ryan is saying cops are literally watching people being drunk, and they're mostly minors. And so, yeah, of course, there's the issue there. It's in plain sight, and they're not doing anything about it. And so provides a lot of issues, a lot of really complex issues that that we are working on. Let's see. Multiple people are typing. Oh, frat houses. Right. Yeah, absolutely, Sylvia. I mean, that seems to be pretty common in a lot of areas in Texas too, where we've started to kind of view alcohol use by minors as a rite of passage. And I think too, and I've been working on some resources just to kind of inform mostly parents that kind of the nature of drinking has changed. It's no longer a group of teenagers maybe splitting a 6-pack, but it's in fact, hard liquor, huge quantities, and just the surrounding environment has become a lot more dangerous. And so the times are changing, and yeah, absolutely, parents are making it available because they feel that, hey, if I'm here, I'm watching it, and something bad won't happen, when that's not actually the case. Let's see, Janice, I don't really. Right, so that's interesting too, at the tailgates. Yeah, and I mean, that's kind of why I think Texas is so interesting. We're a huge state, and so what might be an issue in one community is just not an issue in another, and there are different issues and different approaches to solving those problems all across the state. Yeah, tailgates at UT. Right, and I think the tailgate is so kind of integral to that UT culture that it's going to take a lot to kind of shift that norm. Only one game. You got to go to more. I'm a big football fan here in Texas. Well, that is kind of, well, there's no Paso, Texas. Thank you. That was kind of what my point of this webinar was to present on. So I guess I'll just leave it. If anybody has any other questions or comments, either about brain development, anything that was unclear, or about the underage drinking laws, now would be the time before I turn it over to Lindsay. Negative light to the campus. Yes, I've heard that one before as well. And as Lindsay has said, my email is there at the bottom of the chat box. It's gsewing@texansstandingtall.org. So if you have any questions later that come up, you want any more clarification, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email or give me a call. All right.
So we're going to talk about the 7 intervening variables to underage drinking. which again, I know you all have heard, and feel free to chime in. So first, we have low enforcement. What that looks like is kind of what Ryan has described at UT. Cops literally watching underage drinkers consume alcohol, adults handing over alcoholic beverages to minors. It could also mean, though, a lack of training in laws pertaining to minors and underage drinking, a lack of training in the provision to minors, or even if they know that something's happening and they think they could potentially have a strong case for that provision to minor laws, but they just don't think they could have the evidence, that could result in low enforcement. Easy retail access, so supermarkets or gas stations in areas that never card, that don't know the rules around carding. Retailers don't comply with laws. Lots of liquor stores, supermarkets, gas stations that are selling alcoholic beverages, malt liquors, beer, wine, things like that in one area makes it really easy to find somewhere where someone underage can possess alcohol. Easy social access, so that's parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, moms, best friends, dad's cousin providing unsupervised parties, adults who don't know, and I know that that's especially an issue in the El Paso area, is because there's such a cultural difference and there is an age difference just 5 minutes away on the other side of the Texas-Mexico border. The drinking age in Mexico is 18, the drinking age in Texas is 21, and sometimes people moving into Texas may not realize there's a difference. And so it's really making people aware of the laws, social norms, that rite of passage that we hear, everyone's doing it, making it okay really to participate in alcohol consumption under the age of 21. That's what we mean by social norms. Low perceived risk, so it's really not that big a deal. As long as you stay home and drink, nothing's going to happen. I know you're safe if you're not driving. And you also can't get in trouble with the law. Lower discount pricing, so that's happy hour drink specials, power hour, Thirsty Thursday, things like that. Because and then promotion, especially at sporting events, it's rare. Rodeos, sporting events, carnivals, those places, especially like at, I'm trying to think what it's called I think it's like Fiesta in San Antonio. The vendors there rarely card at those types of events. They just want to make money, and they may not even know what the law is, and they're definitely not asking. So, effective prevention strategies for reducing underage and college drinking. We threw in a couple college drinking because several of you are now in college. So you all know the difference in environmental and individual prevention, but just to go over it, I'm going to read directly from the slide. Individual prevention is strategies that affect individuals by instructing, guiding, and/or counseling. Environmental prevention strategy or strategies that affect society, community, and/or population. When you're focusing on individual change, you're focusing on individual behavior. Your goal is to eliminate personal alcohol use. You're using tools like education and developing refusal skills, and you're targeting parents, teachers, and children. When you're working with environmental change, you're focusing on policy and laws, attitudes, and behaviors. Your goal is community control. You're using tools like media and policy advocacy, social pressure, and enforcing laws. And you're really targeting shared community and individual power. The probability, so attitudes, disapproving of a particular behavior, in this instance, underage consumption of alcohol, the availability of alcohol to underage drinkers, and the regulation of that behavior through policy and laws really increases the probability of it decreases the probability of that undesirable behavior. I was thinking of another way to say that, where it was more positive and increasing something, but I'll stick with the slide. Sorry, guys. This is just sort of the same. So, policy, when you're focusing on policy, you're trying to educate adults on the risk of providing alcohol to minors and require responsible server-seller training. Enforcement, if when we look, so let me start over. When we're looking at kinds of strategies to focus on, prevention strategies, you can choose from, the 5 that are on the screen. You can talk about policy, enforcement, education, community, and collaboration, but really any strategy you choose is going to encompass really all 5 of these things. While your main focus may be policy or something like excise tax, you're really talking about enforcement and education and communication and collaboration, though policy may be your main focus. So, while saying that, policy focuses on educating adults on the risks of providing alcohol to minors and requires responsible server seller training. So those are kind of 2 ways that you could target policy development. Enforcement could be something like excise tax or a minimum legal purchase age, so increasing the age to 25 and not 21. Education could be something like compliance checks or enforcing existent provision of minor laws. Some things to do communication could be social marketing, community forums, or media advocacy, and then collaboration or groups working together to create change. And then it has a greater impact than individuals working alone. So these are all kind of ideas and ways in which you could kind of target those major things. So recommended strategies for minors. Limiting access, so by regulating alcohol outlet density, so really focusing or having cities create ordinances about how many liquor stores or convenience stores can be in a particular area that sell alcoholic beverages. Compliance checks via sting operations with partnering with TABC, things like that. Retail education, seller training, and keg registration, which is really not fun for a lot of people in Texas. They really don't like the idea of keg registration, but the idea of keg registration is kind of ties in with that social host thing, right? If you have to register with a keg, and then that keg was, what's the word I'm looking for? Confiscated during a controlled party dispersal. There was a huge pasture party, and the cops had to break it up, and someone confiscated that keg. And then they were able to track it down and see that it was registered to Tom Smith. Then those cops are going to go to Tom Smith and say, you purchased or rented this keg and it was full of beer, and this keg was confiscated in an underage drinking party. Can you explain that to us? And it sort of backs up that social host stuff and that provision to minors law. Enforcement, so social host accountability, which social host accountability really is a 3-prong approach. It ties in a high visibility enforcement campaign, so really high visibility media campaigns, controlled party dispersal training, and then a social host ordinance, which it's really cool. We've been doing a lot of work here on that social host accountability stuff. We had a really cool social host training that a couple of the YLC members got to attend here in Austin, and it was a lot of fun, and we all learned a whole lot of information. It was just a really cool stuff. And increasing minimum age drinking laws. So instead of at one point, the minimum drinking age was 18. Now it's 21 because we know better. And some people think it should be 25. So, local alcohol advertising policies. So really coming down on those alcohol companies for really marketing to youth, and really enforcing the restrictions that are placed on them, banning certain advertisements in your schools, restrictions on points of sale ads, limits on alcohol sponsorship at public events, sporting events, things like that, and consideration on alcohol ads on billboards, mass transits, and like in stadiums. I mean, even at Little League games, there are alcohol ads, right? And those kids are 5 and 6, so. Recommendations to reduce underage drinking. So community interventions to assess underage drinking problems, community organizing, coalition building, and strategic use of media to address underage drinking. So this is for you college kids, since Ryan and Janice, you are both at a university. Increasing alcohol prices and taxes, so really cutting back on those happy hours and promotional times. Thirsty Thursday, when I was in college, Thirsty Thursday was a big deal. I think on Thursday nights we had 25-cent drinks. Responsible beverage service policy, so really paying attention to someone and cutting them off if they're over the limit, or having a drink limit anyway. You can only buy 2 drinks or whatever. Or, some bars in Austin even, and these are for people who are over 21, one person cannot buy more than 2 drinks at any given time that they're at the bar. So, some places, one person can go up to the bar and buy 4 drinks at a time or 6 drinks at a time, as many as they can carry, and who knows who they're taking those drinks to. But there are lots of places that I've been to here in Austin that you got 2 hands and you can't have more than 1 drink in a hand, right? And so that has changed. It didn't used to be that way. Maintaining and enforcing zero tolerance laws, impaired driving laws, and 21 is the legal limit, and compliance checks and bars. So really making sure that they're carding and looking for people under the influence. So a summary of this webinar is alcohol is still the #1 drug of choice among youth. Adolescent brains are more vulnerable to alcohol-related harms than adults because, right, it forms from back to front, but alcohol affects it front to back. So the last thing to develop is the first thing affected by alcohol. Early alcohol use can lead to long-term cognitive impairment, alcohol dependence, many social harms, and legal consequences. Teens and college students report primarily getting alcohol from parties and friends. And most effective evidence-based strategies to prevent and reduce underage drinking have broad reach rather than individual focus. That's what environmental prevention is. So that is officially the end of the webinar. If you guys have any questions, now would be the time. If you have any questions about the webinar, go ahead and put them in the chat box so that we can address them now. Otherwise, I'm going to stop recording and we can go to the conference call. So let me know if you have any questions in the chat box.